How you doing, Z? Everybody, want to welcome you to the Pastor's Bible Study today. How are y'all doing? Good to see you. And I want to welcome those of you who are here in this room. And for those of you who are joining us online, we're glad to have you. Those who are in this room have the distinct privilege of hanging today, so we can't really replicate that online. I'm sorry. But anyway, we're glad to have him with us today. So, last Wednesday, let me think. Last Wednesday, I'm trying to think where I was in Rome last Wednesday. I was at the catacombs of San Sebastiano and at St. Paul's outside the walls. So, how did Luke do, y'all, while we were here? I thought so too. Luke, thank you. I watched it actually yesterday morning early. Since with my jet lag, I wake up early. So anyway, but I had a chance to watch Luke. Luke did a great job, so thank you, Luke. And grateful that we have these folks who preach and teach and lead, and we're just blessed here as a church, and we're grateful for that. Well, today, here's what I want us to do today. Luke did Genesis 3 last Wednesday, did a great job explaining that particular page in our Bibles. I want us to take a pause today and just do some theological reflection on what we've learned already. We're only 3 pages into the Bible, okay? So we've got this, think about it, we have this massive document that is over 1,500 years of actually being composed. And it covers the story of humanity from the very beginning all the way to the end of the apostolic era, which is about AD 100 when you read the book of Revelation. And so a lot of material, a lot of historical information, a lot of years are covered. And we're just about to study page 4. So before we do that, I want us to just reflect on what we've already learned, because that's really one of the ways that you and I develop our ability to share this story, is we need to reflect on what we've learned and what's already happened. And the book of Genesis is a gold mine for New Testament theologians. It will be this particular book, and these opening pages will stir the imagination of the Apostle Paul. And so Paul will have much to say theologically about what you and I have already just read together, just the first 3 pages. In fact, his letter to the church at Rome, which he wrote about AD 54. He was in Corinth, and he wanted to visit the church at Rome. Never been there before. It was the most powerful city in the empire. He was a Roman citizen, even though he had never actually visited Rome. And the church was very small at that time in Rome. It was meeting in these small house churches. If you read Romans, Paul will greet various people that are in Rome, and he will greet those who meet in these homes of these spiritual leaders. Probably the most famous people in Rome at the time were Priscilla and Aquila. Some people like to think Peter was there when Paul wrote this letter, but if you read Romans 16, Paul does not greet Peter. So if Paul was wrong, what does that tell me? I mean, he wasn't there. Surely Paul would have greeted the most famous disciple. So it was a group of people that we know very little about. And yet in that letter that he sends to the church at Rome, Paul expounds upon the truths that he's discovered, revealed to him through the Holy Spirit, rooted in the story of Genesis. It's Paul's theological reflection. That particular book, the book of Romans, is going to be a gold mine for Augustine. Augustine will come a couple hundred years later or so, and he will begin to explore just the teachings of Paul and how the teachings of Paul grow out of the book of Genesis. And Augustine is going to develop this whole understanding of sin and the pervasive nature of sin. And he's going to write about it, and it is going to dominate Western theology to this very day. And then others like Martin Luther and John Calvin are going to find a gold mine, the book of Romans, connected directly to the book of Genesis. And then John Wesley, who is one of the leaders of the whole revival movement that took place both in Europe and here in the U.S. Wesley was, he says he was just reading Martin Luther's preface to his commentary on the book of Romans, and he found his heart strangely warmed. So he wasn't even to Luther's commentary yet on Romans, and Romans is somewhat of a commentary on Genesis. Wesley was just reading the preface to Luther's work and said he was just overwhelmed with the grace of God. And that whole Wesleyan tradition of revivalism has had an impact upon us. Matter of fact, it's having an impact upon us this very day, because there is an awakening that is breaking out at a Wesleyan school in Kentucky. I don't know if you've read about it or not, but it's happening at Asbury University in 1970. There was a great outpouring of the Spirit of God at Asbury Seminary that had a profound impact upon theological education on into the 70s and 80s. It had an impact on the campus of Southwestern Seminary, still felt when I arrived there in the 80s. So we're grateful to the Lord for these kinds of experiences. But if you think about it, the teachings in the book of Genesis have profound impact in the theological life of the church. So I want us to pause before we go any further, because the story is going to get more and more complex. When you get to page 4, a lot of things start happening. So I want us to just think together about what we've already learned today. You can find it at sacramentaljourney.org later. I think Zach's going to load it for you today as well on this broadcast if you're online. But you have it for you in your room. It's a little dense. Notice there's a good bit of information here. It's not exhaustive, but it's just to introduce you to thinking and reflecting theologically. We're reading this story, and that really is what this is. It's narrative material. Moses, we believe, is the principal author here, inspired by the Spirit of God, and he's telling an incredible story about how everything began. And as he tells the story, theology just starts to leap off the page to us. And so that's what theological reflection is to try to think through what is it that we're learning theologically and how it's going to be authenticated and affirmed. Okay? So, for example, what have we learned? Well, at the very beginning, we've learned a theology about God. We're already learning about God, and we have very little information on these first 3 pages, but we have enough to start something, to start us to begin to think about who God is. So, for example, the Bible opens and God is just already existent. So there's no story about the history of God. There's no explanation of where God came from. God is just assumed. And this particular God is a God who is eternally self-existent. And that's how he's portrayed in the book, independently of all of this. All of this that you and I know is reality and creation and all that it is, as beautiful as it is, God existed absolutely imperfection through eternity before any of this ever appears. So he's self-existent. And then the book of Genesis portrays him as sovereign. He is the one who's moving. He is the one who's taking the initiative. He's the creator. He's the one that brings all this into existence. It is purposeful because it has his handprints on it. He's done it for a reason. It doesn't just exist on its own. And another aspect, personal God, he's going to meet people. And he engages in relationship. But to make no mistake, he is powerful. And he is God. And he will reveal himself that way as we make our way through the rest of this story. We also are beginning to develop a theology of creation. You know, we're recognizing that when we read this story, that creation, the only reason creation exists is because of the act of divine creation. And so as we look at this story, the idea that all of this is some kind of accidental explosion goes away. It melts away according to this perspective. Now, how God chose to do this, that is a subject that science can explore. But why God chose to do it and that God chose to do it is beyond the realm of science. Science is not equipped to answer those kinds of questions. How something took place and what actually exists. And to be honest with y'all, science is our friend because science just authenticates and affirms so many things that we think are consistent with what's told in the Scripture. So I'm not afraid of science. I'm grateful for all the scientific research that's been done to try to understand how all this happened. But you and I know why it happened. It happened because of divine creation. It wasn't just some type of accidental progression. And so we have to ask ourselves honest questions when you assess the history of the universe. When you take it all the way back to if there was some kind of massive explosion, more properly referred to as a Big Bang, if there was some kind of particle that somehow held within it all the mysteries of the universe and everything that was needed for all of creation to exist, even if all that is true, as much as we are trying to figure all that out and scientists spend a lifetime studying it, the question is, where did all of that come from? That's where you end up. Even if you get that far back, you still, as a human, have to wonder, well, how did that appear? And why did it appear? Well, those kinds of questions are the realm of scientific exploration and lead us into another arena, and that's the arena of theology. That's where we are. And so for us, we believe it exists because of the act of divine creation. Therefore, it's purposeful. It has meaning. It's good. God's going to say that over and over and over. And it's going to reflect His glory. One of the ways creation reflects the glory of God is that it's functional, that it works, that it allows us to have life. And it has been designed in such a way that it supports life and it blesses life. And so much of that is something that you and I just take for granted every single day. We don't worry about it. We don't think much about it. We just exist in it. Not a single one of you this morning woke with the fear that gravity was not going to work today. Not one of y'all woke up this morning and just held on to the bed and thought, oh my gosh, oh, this could be the day that gravity could wobble today. And if it does, I'm holding on. No, you just got up because that's what you do. You don't know any better. You know why? Because it works. We just flew 5,000 miles from Rome to Dallas. Guess what? I'm in that airplane. I'm not thinking that that airplane is just going to do this and just keep going on into the expanse of the universe. I think that that pilot has sense enough to know with all the equipment he has that the earth is round and that my flight is going to match the sphere, that it's going to be in sync with the rotation of the earth, that it is actually all going to work. And when it comes time to land, it's actually going to land. And there's going to be a stable enough foundation upon which it can take for granted. Well, you know what? The reason you can take them for granted is because a gracious and loving God has put all this in place, and it all works, and it reflects His glory. So we believe that about creation. Then you get to the latter part of the first page, and then go into the second page, and now we've got to develop a second page, and now we've got to develop a theology of humanity, because God does something amazing as He's in the midst of this incredible creative activity. He decides to create human beings. And so human beings, as I put here in your outline, they're uniquely created by God in His image and different than, distinct from all the rest of creation. As beautiful as the rest of creation is, there's something about us. Human beings have been formed personally by God. We've received the breath of life. Remember, Genesis 1, you have the nouns, the image and likeness of God. In Genesis 2, you have the verbs. God forms and He breathes. And so we are that. So the way I would put it is, human beings are responsible, spiritual, free moral agents designed for fellowship and partnership with God, with each other. Unlike all the rest of creation, none of the rest of that particular assignment. As intelligent as some members of the animal kingdom are, they are not free, responsible, moral agents. They're not. They are not You and I, though, go anywhere in the world and encounter human beings anywhere in the world. And human beings are self-existent, self-aware, created by God, with a deep pondering in their souls. What is all this? Why am I here? What is it I'm supposed to be about? Human beings are male and female. As I said to y'all a couple of Sundays and mornings ago, I'm old enough to remember when that wasn't a controversial statement. Truth as plainly as you know how. This is the way God has designed it. God has created creation with these binary expressions. You have light and dark. You have day and night. You have the sea and the land. And you have male and female. Those binary expressions. And human beings are uniquely blessed by God. Now, with all that said, I want us to settle in for just a minute this morning on this next section, because this is what Luke talked to y'all about last week. And I want you to think with me today about the theology of sin. Luke taught you the story, and he did a wonderful job explaining to you the beauty of the Hebrew. The Hebrew writers loved parallelism. He pointed that out, words that sound alike and have different meanings. Hebrew's limited in its language, and so these writers had to be very creative to be able to pull that kind of thing off. And so the book of Genesis is beautifully crafted. Well, think about it. If we contend that Moses is the principal author, well, guess where Moses went to school as a kid growing up? Auburn, right? I mean the Auburn of his day, obviously. But no, think about it. Where did he grow up? He grows up in the court of the Pharaohs, true? You think he didn't get the finest education that any boy his age could have possibly gotten? Of course he did. This young man received something that none of the rest really of his peers in his Hebrew family would have received. This young man, without doubt, has received an incredible education. Is it any surprise to me that God taps him to write the book of Genesis. He's a Hebrew. Remember, his mama stayed with him. Remember, she nursed him and taught him the stories of the faith. He had that indigenous language affinity for Hebrew, but he was trained in the school of the Egyptians. And so the writings of the first 5 books of the Bible reflect that. And so there's beauty in how it's done, symmetry in how it's shared, even how he tells the story. Next week, we're going to study Genesis 4. I will show you that as well. As you find it in Genesis 4, it matches some of the things we read in Genesis 3. But I want us to pause and not just think about what happened in Genesis 3, okay? Because it is one of the most important pages in our Bibles, okay? It will serve as a gold mine for Paul. It'll stir his imagination. Genesis 2 and 3, Jesus will refer to it. Build a theological system on it that's primarily found in the book of Romans, but you find it in Corinthians and Galatians and Ephesians and other places. So let's just think about the theology of sin. You studied this last week, where Adam and Eve are in the garden, they fall, and then we live with the results of those decisions, okay? So let's talk about what we can gain from that page in our Bible. First of all, evil is real. It is personified and antithetical to the purposes of God. So the serpent, we met the serpent in Genesis 3. I'm grateful for how Luke laid that out for you. How do we know who the serpent is? Well, we're not told in Genesis yet, right? We're just at the very beginning, but we believe in progressive revelation, that the longer this thing goes, the more we know about God. And so when you go to the New Testament, you'll hear, well, in the book of Job, you'll hear this word that we translate Satan, the adversary. And then we get to the New Testament and we come across that Greek word, diabolos, the devil. Well, the devil and Satan are going to be connected in the New Testament. And when you read Revelation 12, remember, not only are we connecting the devil and Satan, we're actually connecting all of that with the serpent. So this serpent is actually directly linked, Revelation, to Satan, the devil. Revelation 20, verses 7 through 10, God is going to judge Satan and the devil, referred to with both names in that passage. And so evil is real. It's personified in this person, if you will, or this being, rather, this angelic being. We don't know, did the fall of Satan take place? And is he actually also called Lucifer in a couple of times in the Old Testament? There's a lot of debate about how to answer all those questions, but here's what we know. He's a Satan and his minions. And so I realize that today, some people would say it's not very popular to believe in a literal Satan. But in my day, there's a whole lot of things in our but I do believe in a literal being, Satan, the devil, the adversary, and I believe he has his minions. You know, C.S. Lewis wrote that series of letters, and they were collected finally. They used to appear in the newspaper, but they eventually, do y'all remember newspapers? Anyway, they finally were collected up in a book, and they're called the Screwtape Letters. And, you know, they're these letters where this uncle is writing to this junior demon, trying to help him understand how to plague people, how to trip them up, how to tempt them. And unfortunately, the guy that's been assigned to Wormwood, who's this junior demon, becomes a Christian. And so Screwtape is really mad at Wormwood for letting the guy become a Christian. So when you start reading the subsequent letters, he tells Wormwood, well, I'm going to paraphrase, you've messed up. You've lost him now forever. Good job. You're going to answer to the master himself for this one, okay? Then he says, so Wormwood never writes him back. You have to infer what Wormwood says. So then he writes him another letter, and he says, okay, Wormwood, no, you can't do what you want to do. Wormwood wanted to show himself, to let this person know, hey, I'm a demon, and I'm going to scare you to death. Here's what C.S. Lewis says in that letter. He says, Wormwood, you can't do that because he doesn't believe you exist. If you show your hand, you're going to mess the whole thing up, because then they'll start really believing in us, is basically C.S. Lewis's point. Well, that's the world we live in. We're too educated to believe in the devil. We've got other explanations for evil. Well, I would tell you that the Scripture is clear. Evil is personified, it's real, it's antithetical to the purposes of God. Sin is inviting. If sin were not inviting, we wouldn't do it. We'd run from it. And so What does the Bible say in Genesis 3? You looked at it last week. Verse 6 of Genesis 3. The woman saw that the fruit of the tree, whatever that was good for food, pleasing to the eye, and desirable. So she took it. Notice Adam's right there with her. Adam's not hiding somewhere. Look what it says. She took it and ate it, and she gave it to her husband, who was standing right there beside her. Okay? So if you want to get all mad at Eve, what about Adam? And guess what? He's going to get the blame for this from Paul. As he should. He's the one that got the instruction, right? This is directly linked to Adam, and there's Adam standing watching this whole thing play out. So, but notice, it was inviting. Well, that's what sin is. It's inviting. John will give you a little take on it in 1 John 2. John will say this in verse 16 of 1 John 2. He says, sin is the lust of the flesh. He calls it pride of life. Well, look how enticing that is. If it weren't, we wouldn't do it. And so, as a matter of fact, we'll read this next week. If you look over at Genesis 4, verse 7, what does God say to Cain? He says, sin is crouching at your door right now. So, of course it's inviting. It's enticing. It makes it look good. I'm not somebody who's hung up on drinking. Y'all know me better than that. But have you ever noticed everybody looks awesome? You want to be in on it. Isn't it funny? They never do a commercial about a drunk driver. They don't do those, do they? This is not what happened. Why? Well, because everything we do, we make choices. And so when it comes to abusing things, and abusing those things, that's when it becomes sinful. Money is not a sin, but you can abuse it, right? The Bible doesn't say that money is evil. What does it say is evil? The love of money. That's what's evil. So Satan can take anything and ruin it. He just can. And he can ruin you right along with it. And he takes no greater joy in us with everything that's good that God's given us. That's just how it works. So God says to Cain, sin right now, I'm looking, it's crouching right here at your door. Well, that's how it works. I would tell you as your pastor, it's crouching at yours too. And mine. That's just how it is. It's inviting. If it wasn't fun, we wouldn't do it. However, guess what we've learned in Genesis 3? The consequences of sin are real and pervasive. Because guess what happens? All of a sudden, you just instantly get separated. Just like that. They sin, notice they're naked. And so they make clothes for themselves. Right off the bat, a degree of separation from each other. And then all of a sudden, they hear God coming. Now, how long, when you get to the end of Genesis 2, the Bible says, and they are in perfect harmony with God, with each other, with God's creation, God's purpose. How long did that last? I like to think it lasted a while. I like to think Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden for a while. Taking care of it, growing, learning, enjoying the bliss and the fellowship of one another, living in that paradise. Yeah. But at some point, the page is going to turn, okay? And when it does, very first thing, all of a sudden God starts to look for them, and now they're hiding from God. Why would they be hiding from God? I mean, they have been in perfect union with God. Well, because sin, it separates us. And now all of a sudden, the partnership with God, working right alongside God, God can trust you. You're his co-laborer. You're going to help him tend this garden. Well, not anymore. As a matter of fact, not only are you not going to tend it anymore, I'm going to remove you from it. And now you're separated from the very purpose for which you've been created, from each other, from God. That's what sin does. It robs us. It steals things from us, things that are beautiful, that God designed for us. So the consequences of sin are real. Now here's the question some people ask when they read this Genesis 3. Okay, got it. Okay, Adam and Eve did it. What's that got to do with us? I mean, so I get it. They messed up. Why does that matter to me? I'm living in 2023. I'm a long way from the Garden of Eden, okay? And I'm a pretty good guy. So why in the world does this have anything to do with me? Well, it's a great question. But here's what is going to happen. This story is going to unfold. And if you think Genesis 3 is bad, read Genesis 4. And then keep reading. Keep reading what human beings end up doing. You know, this thing is going to only get worse. It's just going to continue to compound. And so sin has actually affected all of humanity. So now let's put our New Testament glasses on for a minute. And let's look at this from Paul's perspective. Now we go all the way to the other side of Jesus, this side of Jesus. And now the Spirit of God has been given. And now God has singled out people, just like he singled out Moses. Do you think it's any accident that God singled out Paul to be this chief theologian of the early church? Who was Paul? Think about Paul. Think about his pedigree. He was trained at the feet of Gamaliel, right? I mean, he went to Jerusalem to study. He went to Harvard. He didn't just stay. He grew up in Tarsus. Do you know that Tarsus was known as the university center of that part of the world? Brilliant people lived in Tarsus. It's kind of like Alabama, kind of what y'all think of when you think of where I've come from. Just the sup. But even that wasn't good enough. Paul wanted to know, because guess what Paul does? He goes and studies at the school of Gamaliel. Later, Paul will say to you, you think you're something? I'm a Pharisee. I'm not just a Pharisee. What does he say about himself? I'm a Pharisee of the Pharisees. You think you know the law? I've studied the law. And then all of a sudden we encounter the fact this boy grew up in Tarsus, so guess what else he can do? He can speak and write Greek. He's not just a Hebrew theologian. This is someone who's well-versed in Greek philosophy. So consequently, he'll show up in Athens and he finds himself completely at home in Athens. Why? Because he grew up in that culture. Or he can go to Jerusalem and he can sit on a student. So is it any accident that Paul will take this guy, a Roman citizen, well-educated, and breathe the Spirit of God through him to help us understand theologically what's just happened? Well, no, it's not accident. So Paul, in his brilliant mind, looks at all of this and says, let me explain to you what's happened. And we'll go all the way back to the book of Genesis. Because Paul has studied this story. Here's what Paul knows is about to happen. Turn one page in Genesis. One page and Cain's going to kill his brother. They're not just going to take a bite out of a piece of fruit. Here's where things really start happening. Cain's going to kill his brother out of rage and jealousy. Then Cain is going to be as best we can tell, Adam and Eve had other children, girls that aren't mentioned. That's what I would say. So he marries his sister, and they leave. And then they start having children. You know, the human family is very small at this point. And then if you read Genesis 4, you remember how God said, if anybody attacks you, I'm going to judge them. I'm going to protect you. You are Adam and Eve's son 7 times. Guess what's going to happen? He's going to start having kids, and you get all the way down to Lamech, chapter 4, verse 27. And Lamech is going to say this, I can kill a man who's wounded me, and if you think Cain was going to be judged, Lamech will be judged 77 times. I mean, we've gone from Cain to Lamech just like that, and evil now has become pervasive in this family. And you can kill on a whim, and if anybody touches you or bothers you, you're going to judge them more than Cain was ever judged. Does that make sense? In other words, what's happening? Well, we are on a descending journey here. Sin's affected all of humanity. Get to Corinth, AD 54, and Paul is under the guidance of the Spirit. He's processing all of this. And so Paul then says in Romans 3, guess what? None of us are righteous. None of us. As a matter of fact, Paul will say, all of us have sinned. And we've fallen short of what? The glory of God, the very thing we discover in the book of Genesis we're designed for. The very reason we exist, to bear His image, reflect His glory. Paul says it's affected everybody. And Paul says in Romans 5, verse 12, you don't know where it starts? Paul says, I want to take you all the way back to Genesis 3. Adam. It's in Adam. You see, Genesis portrays Adam as a real man, not a type, not a figure, but a real person. Genesis 3, Genesis 4, there are consequences for all of this. And so Paul reads all of that, studies all that, and he sees that sin enters the world through Adam, and all sinners are condemned, he says in Romans 5, verse 18. All of us have been condemned. All of us stand separated from God. We're not just separated from God, we are guilty and we are condemned because of our sin. And not only that, it hasn't just affected us. Even creation can no longer be referred to as very good. Paul says in Romans 8, starting in verse 18, creation is groaning for its day of redemption. So what happens in Genesis 3 is so pervasive that it affects every single human being who's ever born since then. It even affects the very creation that emerged out of the mind and heart and the will of God in the first place. And so we're already developing a healthy theology of sin, just on these later explained to us by Paul. And we notice that sin must be punished. What happens in Genesis 3 to the serpent? God says, I'm going to curse you. That's what I'm going to do. We have no idea what the serpent's existence was like before that, but we know since that, don't we? And he curses it. As a matter of fact, God, 2 verse 17 to Adam, don't eat from this tree, because when you eat from this tree, you will die. Well, he didn't die right then, did he? Physically, but he died spiritually. Next thing you know, he's hiding from God. And what does the Bible say about human beings? Human beings love darkness because their deeds are evil. You think Adam's the last guy to hide from God? Seriously. I'd probably be honest enough to stay in this room at some point, and every single one of our lives, we've even tried it. God's the best hide-and-go-seek player that has ever lived. Last thing you can do is hide from him. He sees all. So, sin has to be punished. It requires atonement. It's got to be covered. You can't just leave it. That's not how it works. It's got to be addressed. Once it's done, it's done. And so guess what happens in Genesis 3? Adam and Eve make fig leaves for themselves, and God says, no, see, that's your attempt to cover. That's not going to work. And then we have a very interesting little story that we don't hear much about yet. So what does God himself do? He makes a covering for them. Well, how does he make a covering? Yeah, it's a skin and animal. Blood has to be by God. Think about that. Moses doesn't comment on it. He just tells it happened. But what a statement. Already what I'm learning is sin's got to be atoned for. Something innocent has got to pay a price. Blood's going to have to be shed. No, it's going to take a long time for us to figure that out theologically, right? The old-timey preachers used to call it the scarlet thread of redemption. Y'all ever heard that phrase? This is where it starts. And it's going to wind its way. And guess where it's going to end up? On a cross right outside of Jerusalem. And this time it's not going to be some innocent animal. It's going to be the Lamb of God. It's powerful, y'all. We're just on page 3. I mean, we ain't even met Abraham. And we're already learning all this. Sin necessitates forgiveness, justification, salvation. In other words, it puts something in place that I've got to address. And so when we sin, we need to be forgiven. And now that we're sinners, we're standing outside the will of God. And we're judged guilty. The only hope is that somehow we'll be judged innocent. Well, how is that possibly going to happen when you know good and well we're not innocent? How could we stand in a courtroom and hope we're going to be declared innocent when we know good and well we're guilty? Well, guess what? Paul is going to help us understand that in the book of Romans, that it is through Christ and through the righteousness of God that belongs to God himself. You and I are somehow, miraculously, by the grace of God, going to be pronounced innocent and saved. From what? Hell. Ourselves. A purposeless existence. Just meandering through. Do you want to just meander through life? And then show up one day and it's over? And you wonder, what did I do? Did I ever join myself to anything purposeful? How many people die empty? We need to be saved. And it's not just saved from hell. Of course we need to be saved from hell, but we need to be saved from ourselves, from a senseless, purposeless, meaningless life. My world is filled with people who live that way, and what they pour their lives into amounts to nothing. And so, what does God offer us? Salvation. Are y'all still with me? Like I said, we're only on page 3. Real quickly, redemption. The theology of redemption begins in Genesis. God has an answer for sin, brokenness, separation. You find it in verse 15 of chapter 3. God says, I'm going to put enmity between you, serpent, and the woman, between your seed and her. That's what the Hebrew text says. Now think about that. In the Hebrew understanding of progeny, a woman never has the seed. A man has the seed. Okay, so that wouldn't even make sense biologically or theologically, even when this was written. Because even by the time of Moses, they already knew progeny was passed on by the man. And yet he says the seed of the woman. Now what is that implying? That implies some kind of miraculous intervention is going to take place at some point in the future. And he says when it does, he will crush your head. Now you'll bruise his heel, sure. In other words, there'll be a scar here. This isn't going to happen easily. But you just need to know you will be crushed because redemption is on the line here. The salvation of everything. So the answer is there. That's really the earliest statement of the gospel in the Bible. And it's going to find ultimate fruition one day with Jesus. That's why Satan just encounters Jesus straight up. No need to beat around the bush. No need to mess around with it. Just straight up take Jesus on. Because Satan well remembers this prophecy. Don't you love that the very first prophecy in the Bible comes from the lips of God himself? So, God will defeat and destroy sin. God's plan of redemption will offer rescue, redemption, and restoration for humanity and creation. You see, what God's going to do is, he's not just going to save us. He's going to save everything. He's not just going to redeem me and you. He's going to redeem it all because it all belongs to him. Now, the devil he's inched in. You know, C.S. Lewis said one time, every square inch of creation is claimed by God and counterclaimed by the devil. So the devil has made inroads. There's no doubt about that. He's made his way through this old world. And one day, he will ultimately be destroyed. And God is going to redeem all of it. He's going to redeem all of his creation. He's going to redeem all of humanity who accepts Jesus. They're going to be rescued, redeemed, restored. As a matter of fact, if you go to 12, it kind of all starts really there when God says, okay, here's how I'm going to do it. This family right here, this family is going to steward this on everybody else's behalf. And ultimately, it's going to bless all the families of the world. It's going to start with this one. Bless all the families of the world. And then you come to the last page of the Bible. And John says, and then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. Wow. And there, the tree of life reappears. And so it's all going to be restored to its original glory. What a word from God. That's where this thing's headed. But we got a long way to go before we get there. You know, like I said, we're only on page 3, okay? All right, I'm going to stop right there. Online folks, thank you for joining us today. We're grateful to have you.